Does that mean it's like it was in the 90s? I think not. Does it mean we have to continue to give clean athletes support and a system that is going to have their back? Absolutely. It's too important to go the other way.
I get that, and I get the idea that people who've cheated in the past are often very valuable commodities, and it just kind of brings me on. When I saw that you said that doping is never justified and always inexcusable, it just immediately triggered with me the current case, which is quite close to home for you at the moment, which is with the UFC and with Jon Jones, who of course tested positive for 2 banned substances in 2016, and then we have the turinabol finding from 2017, which has obviously flared up over the last month. He's a guy who's tested positive for banned substances, and he's fighting in a sport where he can do serious damage to your opponent. How do you tally that with your own idea that doping is never justified and always inexcusable?
Yeah, look, it's you have to look at each individual case. And let me be real clear on the quote. Look, people in systems try to say and justify their doping by everyone was doing it and that made it okay. And that's the point with the Brunel case and the cycling cases. Stand up, have the courage to say, you know what, it's against the rules. It's not okay. It's not justified. I think we all, as people, can attempt to justify whatever we do when it comes time to decision making. But the rules are the rules. Play by the rules, even if it means you might have to leave the sport, you might have to leave the sport. Hopefully that's not the answer, because look, there are independent organizations here today that have your back, that are all going to fairly enforce the rules and ensure that your right to compete clean is upheld. So to Jon Jones, listen, that's exactly what happened. He got a 15-month suspension through the arbitration panel for an inadvertent doping violation. There was no intentional cheating. And
how did we actually come to that conclusion, Travis? Because obviously Richard McLaren was involved and says that there was no intentional ingestion of turinabol. For a guy who's previously served a doping violation, to give him the benefit of the doubt there seems really strange.
Well, you have to look at the evidence. It's not what you feel or what you think. Look at the evidence.
But where's the evidence that he took it non-deliberately? Obviously there's no evidence to suggest he took it deliberately, but if I'm looking at a guy who's previously served the doping suspension, I'm not really giving that guy the benefit of the doubt that he took it accidentally.
Listen, nobody gave any athlete any benefit of the doubt other than what the facts and the evidence shows. And the evidence was clear, and all the scientific opinion that was presented to the independent arbitrator was clear that there was no intent to dope, because if you look at the negative tests where there was no M3, which is not parent drug, which is not the M1 drug, not the M2 metabolite, only the M3, it was at a minuscule level shortly after negative tests, and then negative tests before the small finding. So the evidence, the scientific,
but it's still a positive test.
But that wasn't the question you asked me. The question you asked me was, how can you say it wasn't intentional? And yes, it was an adverse analytical finding. It was reported, and it went through the results process. But we do an individual analysis in every case. Was it an intentional cheating? And if it was, they would have gotten the full maximum sanction, just as we've applied in every other case. But look, we had a 90-year-old cyclist test positive for minuscule trace amounts of a drug that can come in meat.
Yeah, and he got a ban.
We investigated it and came out with, he got a public warning. So Jones got 15 months because the evidence, the negative test before, the negative test immediately after, showed that there was no way he took an intentional dose to enhance his performance, because the test result would have been much higher than the test result that was bookended by a negative and a positive test. So look, we're here to fairly enforce the rules, but we're not going to hang a guy up just because of a contamination or an inadvertent positive, just like in the meat contamination case. Just look, we announced a water contamination case. We announced a medication contaminated case. That's how a fair system operates. Like, we're gonna throw the book where we have authority at intentional cheats, but we're also going to be fair and just to people who have positive tests that aren't indicative and demonstrate that they weren't intentionally cheating.
Yeah,
I think that's the essence of a fair system.
Sure. Like, to be fair, there was a negative test regarding Jones on December 29th from USADA, but oddly, on the very same day, he was tested by VADA and he came up positive. How can you be confident in the testing system when he was tested on the same night and one test shows up as negative, one test shows up as positive from two different organizations, granted?
He tested positive the day before and then a negative that day because of his specific gravity, which is the amount of water that's in your system. At these really, 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 really low levels, specific gravity can affect the lab's ability to see these trace amounts or not. And I think the test you're referring to, I don't have the dates in front of me, but I think the test you're referring to was the weigh-in date where he had lost significant amount of water weight, and the drug was there again at these really low picogram levels. And then the next day when we tested him before the fight, he had obviously, put weight back on and had drunk a lot of water, and so it wasn't in there. And that, if you followed the case and looked at the evidence, it is clearly consistent with the scientific determination of why one on that day was positive at that low level and then negative the next day.
Sure. Like, it is an interesting philosophical one, and I think why we get so exercised about it is because it is combat sports. You can do severe damage to your opponent, and you look at some of the other combat sports and the Canelo Alvarez situation. I know it's not you guys, it was VADA who tested Canelo Alvarez, and due to that clenbuterol finding a couple of months ago and for that ban. But then you look at the USADA one over Eric Morales in 2012 being allowed to fight despite testing positive beforehand. I guess just my question to you, Travis, is if you think you fail a test once as a combat sports competitor, do you think you should be allowed back into the ring or the octagon once again, given the inherent dangers?
Yeah, look, if you intentionally cheat and a positive test demonstrates that, you ought to be thrown out. And athletes in certain sports, push for lifetime bans on one offense. That said, if you don't intentionally cheat, but you have a positive test and there's no performance benefit that's been given, I don't think you should be thrown out of the sport for really any period of time. I mean, eating a piece of meat that is contaminated with a drug at such a low level that it had no impact on your performance, is it fair? You would be asking me, is it fair to keep them out of sport? And I would agree that it's not fair. Having the Therese Johaug case, for example, out of Norway, or a skier who used a lip balm that contained a really, really low level of prohibited substance, caused her to have a positive test, but she was out of competition, had no impact on her performance. She got a 16-month suspension and lost her opportunity to go to the Winter Olympic Games. Is that a right outcome? Look, I don't think it is. I don't think that's a fair system. So to answer your question, if you intentionally cheat, you ought to be thrown out of the sport. But if you have a positive test that is non-intentional cheating and gave you no performance enhancement because water or a supplement or meat or a lip balm caused it, I don't think you should get any suspension.
And you don't think combat sports should be held to a higher standard?
Look, I think for sure, combat and every sport within the Olympic movement should be held to the highest standard. But again, no performance enhancement benefit. There's no health or safety issue. The positive test is not from anything that you intentionally did to try to gain a performance advantage. Look, I think the system is that hammers 16 months for a Therese Johaug for a lip balm is not a fair system. Someone that eats meat, right, served in a restaurant that has a positive test that receives a sanction, I don't think that's a really fair system, whether you're in a combat sport or not.